Welcome to another panel discussion for the Multipliers Movement. My name is Dan Pizzette. I'm the Director of Church Development for the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I am joined by four excellent colleagues, and I want to introduce them to you. We have with us Paul Nixon, the Director of Church Multiplication for Discipleship Ministries. We also have Kay Catan, the founder of View Unlimited and Impressions Unlimited. Also joining us is Kelly Brown, the Director of Congregational Vitality for the East Ohio Conference, and Rachel Gilmore, Director of Recruiting, Assessing, and Training for Discipleship Ministries, working with church planters there. So last time we talked about the keys for starting and sustaining a multipliers movement. Today's panel discussion is on the key characteristics of multipliers. Let's dive right in. Kelly, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, I will. I want to talk about the heart motivation for introducing people to Jesus. And to talk about that, I just want to share a little bit of my own personal story as an example of that heart and motivation. I know in my own life, after growing up in a home where we were very engaged in church activities, very engaged in all the faith development opportunities that came through those activities, and that as I went to college and began to make decisions in my life that were contrary to some of those faith opportunities and growth that I had, and I had found myself in a place where I was really feeling lost. It was the power of God's grace, the relationship with Jesus that rescued me from that darkness. And I could not imagine life right now any differently. And because of that experience, I have a heart, a motivation to share that story, to share that with others. Not my own personal story as much as the fact that Jesus can be that light in the darkness. And I believe that heart and that motivation comes out of our own personal experience. As I was serving churches, the best sermons I ever preached came out of my own personal faith journey. And that was the motivation. That was where the power came, because I was witnessing to how my life had been changed through a relationship with Jesus. So I think that heart and that motivation first comes from our own personal experience. And when we can authentically witness to how our lives are changed, when we can share with people what it is about our relationship with Jesus Christ that the world has to know, then we are making the difference that we're called to make. But it comes out of that personal experience that we have with Jesus. And with Jesus. And I'm always reminded of, first, that to do that heart and that motivation, you just have to be somebody's friend. In the previous podcast, we talked about the relationship component, and it's just as easy as being someone's friend. And Bill Easom's quote always sticks with me, and that is, first, listen to their story before sharing your story on the way to telling the story. And that quote, that idea that it grows out of our own faith experience, I think is where you provides that motivation, that heart to want to change the world by introducing people to Jesus.
I love that, Kelly. And I think it's so important that is the number one characteristic that we start talking about, because you're right. Without that, you can't lead a multipliers movement, because that's the why. That's the why of what we do, why we do what we do. And so after that, I think for me, another important characteristic of those leading a multipliers movement is what I would sum up in one word as grit. And my hero when it comes to this is Angela Duckworth. And I am fascinated. She has TED Talks. She has a book called Grit. But West Point was trying to figure out why so many of their cadets in the incoming class, when they had to go through like their 6-week summer indoctrination, why so many people would quit. And West Point was like, listen, sometimes the smartest people, sometimes the strongest, the most talented walk away. Like, how do we figure out who's going to stay and who's going to leave? And Angela Duckworth developed this like grit scale and assessment that has been their most effective resource. And when it comes to grit, it measures two things. things. You can go online and take this in just a few minutes and figure out how gritty you are. But it measures two things: your passion and your perseverance. And for me, when it comes to a multipliers movement, if you don't have that passion, which kind of connects to that first characteristic, that why, I want to share this love that has transformed my life with everybody I meet, you need that along with that perseverance that I know, because in church planting, we all know that when you start planting a church, everything is going to go wrong on a Sunday or two or 10, that things will get hard. Your greatest givers will walk out the door. I was 9 months pregnant and our church trailer got stolen that had everything in it on a Wednesday, stolen. And we had to have church on a Sunday. And I'm like, I am just trying to not have a child here as I'm talking to the cops about why the church is now gone. So without that grit, without that perseverance, you won't necessarily stay the course in a multiplier movement. So a very important characteristic to consider.
Rachel, I was interviewing a candidate for a church plant situation in Alabama, and the thing that caught my imagination about how he might do was the fact that he had gone off to college and failed everything in the first semester. And the dean sat down with him and said, basically, unless you make straight A's in the second semester, you're not going to be here in the third semester. And he pulled himself together and did it. And it was sort of like he recovered from such a bad first fail. And it's like, okay, so he proved that he had perseverance under extreme pressure to dig his way out. And it's been a really good plant, by the way. He's just awesome.
I love that. That's great.
But the third characteristic that I wanted to say was about willingness to experiment and innovate. But without that perseverance, the first time you try something and it fails, you're going to be discouraged and you're going to stop. And last time I spoke about the fact that I have a pastor friend who was an improv stand-up comic prior to going into ministry. Actually, some of her sermons, she's still an improv stand-up comic, and that's kind of fun. But one other rule of improv is that you have to expect to fail. You have to expect it. If you're going to try something new, in order to adapt to a new, who bats 1,000 all the time? Sometimes it's not going to work. And so she was talking about throwing out a joke that bombs. Okay. Now, isn't it, we've all been in situations where we were either in a party or, God forbid, standing at a podium talking to a group of people, and we told the joke and it was like you throw a grenade out into the room and it doesn't go off and then it starts rolling back toward the podium, and it's just like, it's a sick feeling, when you try a joke and it doesn't work, but you just got to roll with it, because there's no way to know what jokes are going to work until you try a few of them and they don't work. So I was on this cruise ship and I'm having lunch and it was very crowded, and I sat down and I realized that I was sitting with the woman who was the stand-up comic for the show that night, and she was working through her material just off of cruise ship stuff. And so I started having this conversation with her about, what's funny about the buffet and all this kind of thing. And she's, what a strange conversation. But the point that I learned in all of that is that she knew that she was doing fresh material, and she knew it wasn't all going to work. Some of it was not going to be funny, and she had to just be fearless to get in there and try it anyway. So planning. So let's say we bat 300. It means that 7 out of 10 times it didn't work, and it's okay. If you are not trying very hard, you'll be scared. But if you're trying, you're going to be innovating, and and innovating means that most of the stuff that you try, it didn't work. So I came out of a situation in Florida where we really had nailed our context, and we just and almost everything we did was working by a certain point in time. Not at first, but it got to where we knew it really well. And so we were multiplying, and we'd start a new service over here, just all these new services. And then I took that same playbook to Washington, D.C., to a different generational group 14 years ago, and almost nothing worked in the same way that it worked in Florida. Significant adaptation had to occur before we began to see fruitfulness. And, as we do multiply ministry, you're not just multiplying to clone places, because every zip code, every people group is different. And as we deal with new people groups, we have to adapt. And sometimes there's a learning curve and a lot of bad jokes that just fall flat, before it begins to sort of find synergy. But, we tried several things in DC, and by about the third year, stuff was working. But boy, I'll tell you, in years 1 and 2, it was a little discouraging. And that's a part of the drill. When we're multiplying, we better be ready to just know that some of the time, especially early on, we're going to try some things. It's not going to work. There's no universal playbook of best practices. There are some best principles, but those practices have to be contextualized. And so we're not cloning ourselves in multiplication. We're developing leaders who are competent to go out and reach new people groups, to reach their folks, and to reach people that we can't reach, and to do things that we wouldn't do, but that work for them and that work in those contexts.
That's so important. And Paul, it makes me think of, we have a mutual friend who's a planter in North Texas, and she said that she's not only learned that it doesn't always work the first time, but she's had to teach her whole church. And now they know they have like this mantra, third time's the charm, because they know they have to try every new thing 3 times before it takes, so they don't get discouraged. And so her ability to share that and empower other leaders to not take it personally has been huge.
And sometimes we have to tweak the existing or just throw it out completely, right? And part of it is kind of the wisdom to know which of those two it is as well.
I generally said after that third time, if it's not the charm, it's time to just give it a break and, really start from scratch.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So those are all great key characteristics of multipliers that we've just talked about. You take all of them together, and I ask the question, how do we get all of that and disseminate that through the congregation and through your community? And it comes down to having great communication skills. To be a great communicator is a characteristic of a great multiplier. And when I say great communicator, I do mean from the pulpit for pastors, but I mean so much more than that too. To be able to communicate the vision that God has given your church to move forward and to multiply is important. And to do that in both verbal and nonverbal ways, to live that out, to practice the key characteristics that we've just talked about, to show that passion, that drive, to show that you're being innovative and risking things and not afraid to fail, and that you're going to experiment and move forward. That kind of passion comes across through your actions, through your words. And that's where this all really comes together. Knowing what your vision is, being able to paint that picture with language. If you're doing what God has called your church to do, what does it look like when it's finished? What is that finished image? And you have to remember that we are people that often suffer from spiritual amnesia. And so we have this vision creep that we start losing our way. And so great communicators know that you have to continuously communicate that vision, that you have to remind sometimes yourself and others, this is the vision, this is where we're headed, this is what we're doing. And so not just in the pulpit, but also so many times I see pastors that ignore the pulpit as a place for vision casting and for communicating the message about multiplying and where we're going. So to be intentional that the pulpit is a place to do that, and to make sure that you are prepared and ready, that you show all of these characteristics from the pulpit is important. Especially the first one that we started with, Kelly, the way that you put yourself out there and show your passion and your drive. Give the why for this. This is why it's important to motivate people and to introduce people to Jesus. When you're communicating that, it's so easy to catch the vision because we all have a heart for that. There's just that space in our heart that is ready to go to hear that kind of a vision.
Absolutely.
I wanted to jump back to Kay, what you were talking about a moment ago. I've heard you talk, Kay, about failing fast and just the fact you got to keep, you can't do this slow-mo. You got to try things sort of quickly, or you're going to run out of time. Do you have any thoughts on the way that we fail fast, as opposed to just kind of dragging out the same experiment for months and months and months?
Right. I think sometimes we get so invested in a particular strategy that we feel like we've got to keep trying because we have spent so much time or money or passion to try this. And when it doesn't work, we so often say, well, we'll just try harder. We'll just try harder. But what we need to do is to begin to recognize much more quickly when it isn't going to work, so that we can try to tweak or completely change depending on the circumstances. And then, and so it's like fail quickly and try something else again. So fail forward, fail quickly, because we're moving at such a quick pace culturally that we just don't have the time to sit in something that isn't working. And I think we also have to remember, just because it works this week or this month does not mean it's going to work next month. And so we go back to that, flexibility that we talked about last time as well. So we got to be willing to innovate, but we also got to be willing to say, oh, this didn't work, so let's try something else and move on quickly and learn from it. It's not a failure. We've learned something from it, and it will inform how we go forward.
And sometimes we can fail cheaply too. We don't have to invest, like we're going to be doing something forever if we don't know that we're going to be doing it forever. If we're just trying it out, we can go easy. It doesn't have to be all, fully formed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Paul, one of the ways that I live that out is I strongly encourage churches I'm working with to never call anything the first annual something.
Yeah.
Because that locks you in forever, and it limits flexibility. It limits the ability to step back and reflect and to change. And so why limit yourself? Why put yourself in that spot? So just call it a barbecue. Don't call it the first annual barbecue, and lock yourself into it.
Absolutely. I love it. I love all these characteristics, everything that everybody shared. And to your point, Dan, yeah, there's a difference between like a rhythm and a rut, right? And so if it's the first annual, sometimes by the 10th or 15th or 20th annual, you get into that mantra that can totally decimate a multiplier movement of we've always done it this way. So
absolutely,
it can be painful. So just to recap a little bit for those of you joining us today, the 5 characteristics that we talked about for multipliers. The first one is to have a heart and motivation for introducing people to Jesus. Characteristic number 2 is to have passion and drive, or i.e. grit. Characteristic number 3 is a willingness to experiment and innovate. And that's coupled with characteristic 4, which is not being afraid to fail, failing fast, recovering fast, failing forward. And then the final characteristic is being a great communicator of that vision and message. So we've covered just a short list. Guys, this is not an exhaustive list at all, but we hope that it gives you some insight into key characteristics of multipliers leading effective multiplication movements. So catch us next month as we talk about multiplication in existing small groups.
Yeah, and Rachel just said this isn't an exhaustive list. So if you have more things to add to the list, you can find us on Facebook at Multipliers Movement, and you can keep the conversation going there about these characteristics. Anything you heard or anything you want to add to, you can put there on our Facebook page, Multipliers Movement. Also, on that Facebook page, you'll find resources, panel discussions, podcast, all those things are there. So don't miss out on any of that. Again, like, comment, share it with others who are ready to learn, who are ready to lead in a multiplier movement in their setting. But thanks again for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun. We are the Multipliers Movement, and remember, today is the day to multiply your impacts.